Okay, class. So in this lesson, we are gonna be doing just six watercolor techniques, and these are very basic techniques. Nothing really hard about it. Now, there is a lot more techniques, but with everything being, most of my students being virtual, we're gonna keep it simple as possible. Um, Now, the watercolors we will be using, these are very basic Crayola education watercolors, okay? And these are pretty much the watercolors I have been showing you all last week. And we have 8 colors: black, brown, violet or purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. And that is all we need. Now, there are different brands of watercolors. But, for this video, we keeping it simple, but I will show you uh, other brands that my artists could use. You can always pick these up at Michael's, Amazon. I also have another set right here. But for this particular video, we'll just be doing the very basic watercolors here. Okay. All right. So the six techniques that we will be doing, and I already got some examples laid out for you. First technique is what we call a solid wash. Notice the paint. So when we say solid wash, that means all of the paint is going to be even throughout. Okay. Next is what we call a grated wash. And I'm not going to lie, this technique can be a little bit better, but basically what you are trying to do, just like you do with value, you're trying to do light to dark or dark to light. So you want to go dark and you want to move down and get lighter. Or it doesn't matter, you can start out dark from the left here and make the paint lighter. Okay, honestly, the way I do like to do this technique, and I will explain it in the video, is I like to load my brush with a lot of paint, dip it in that water, start off, and as I move the brush, my initial stroke is automatically going to be darkened. As I move, the paint is thinning out, so you're going to automatically build a dark to light in there. Next is what we call the glazing technique, okay? Now, with this, if you notice the background here and it's real light, but I did a yellow in the back. You want to do a light color, okay? Because we're going to come back over the top of it and glaze it with a darker color. And this, so on this block here, I chose orange and green to glaze it with. See if y'all could see it, but yeah, I mean the yellow could be a little bit darker, but again, you glazing it, so you want it to be translucent. This technique right here is what we call wet on wet. That technique, and you're gonna see in the video, is I'm going to wet the block first. Wet the block, really wet. I mean, it really has to be like more saturated than what you think. So you load that brush up and you load that block up with water. Find the color that you want to use, dip it in there, and boom. Now, you will know if you used enough water because you will get what we call these sort of like these little bloom effects. They're not as strong as they should be because the paint and dry, but yeah. Again, you want it to look watery. Remember, this is watercolors, okay? Actually, on this, what we call drop color, on wet color, balloons really took to shape. That's what we call blooms. Okay, and on that, you'll load that block up with water. Get your brush, dip it in that paint. Me, I actually like to go back in and dip my brush in with water, and then I'm adding wet color. And then I'm gonna come back, dip my brush in the water, load a little paint on it, and drop color on there. So that's basically what we mean, drop color on wet color. Dry brush, dry brush. You may notice if you look, just like it sounds, you want to see dry brush strokes in this technique, okay? And this is good for, like, you know, different things, like if you're doing landscape, texture of grass, texture of bushes, trees, almost like fireworks, okay? So what I want you to know is all these techniques serve a purpose, and the plan is for you to do a watercolor composition using these techniques, although you will be using more and you don't even know it, okay? So what you need for this video: watercolors, water, and paper towel. Now, I'm a left-hander, so all of my stuff is going to be to the left on the video, okay? And your brush. Now, there's many different types of brushes also, but again, we're using what we got at the moment, okay? Okay, so a cup of water. You could use a plastic cup for that. I'm just using an old dirty cup that I've been had for a couple of years here. Your watercolors, paper towels, and of course your brush. Now, for those of you that got the watercolor set from me, the brush should already be in there. So you should be good on that. Now we're gonna start off with the top 3 here. Okay. Put my camera here so y'all can really see this. All right, there we go. So we're starting off with the solid wash, grated wash, and what we call glazing. Okay. Now, you don't have to necessarily choose the same colors that I'm going to be working with. Like, look at my watercolor set. It's actually pretty beat up here, honestly. Yeah, you don't have to necessarily work with the same colors I do. Now, on certain techniques, you are going to have to use light colors for your first initial application. So with me, I am going to start off with a solid wash. Now, you got a brand new set. You want to kind of load that brush up with water. I mean, I always got my paper towel right next to me, you know, because I don't want it. If I feel like my brush is too saturated, I just dry that bad boy up. But I'm going to go out with a blue. You know, one thing about watercolors is people forget. It's watercolors for a reason. The water is the most important thing in here. You know, and a lot of times with watercolors is people don't use enough water. Okay? Right, so on solid wash, we're trying to get even tone throughout the block. Now, you ain't got to fill up the whole block. Notice how the top is darker. Well, that's because that was my first initial stroke, okay? Now, I could come back to the top of this and try to even this out as best I can. Or I could take a piece of paper towel and even it out. And that is pretty much it. Try to even even it out just a little bit more. So that's pretty much an even tone throughout. That is what we call a solid wash in watercolors. Next, let's do the graded wash. Graded wash, we're going to try to do a dark to light. So we are trying to do value with our hue. Hue, just another name for color. And I am going to go with, do something different here. I'm actually going to go with black. I can actually see, still got my watercolor set here. That's so y'all can see that. Okay. My water there. You know, a lot of people like to do the over top view. I don't know, for some reason I like this view better. It works better for me being a left-hander. Okay, so make sure you clean your brush before you go back into that watercolor palette, okay? I'm going here, my initial stroke. Now, I already noticed this. It's not dark enough. But I'm going to continue to lay down the paint here. And the more time you do it, you're actually going to build a dark to light because the paint is standing out the brush, okay? Now, what I want to do, because I want my value to be a little bit better than this, okay? I'm going to go in, I'm going to add a little bit more paint to my brush. Add a little bit more paint, and I want my graded to be just a little bit more better than that. There we go. Now we're starting to build a better dark to light. And there we go. That is a graded wash, dark to light. Real good for doing like value. I mean, in your skies and your mountains, and just depending on what you're drawing, okay? All right, so that is our graded wash. Let's move on to what we call glazing. Make sure you dip that brush in that water. Dry it off with paper towels. Make sure you have more than one piece of paper towel handy, okay? Glazing. I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna go with a yellow. Now, usually with glazing, when we lay the first application down, we gotta wait for it to dry. In this case, I'm gonna dry it with paper towel, then I'm gonna come over the top of it with a different color. And it has to be a darker color. There we go. And yellow's a little dirty. Okay, now I'm gonna take my paper towel and I'm gonna dry this out. What I do is tap it. There we go. Very light, very light. Now, I'm gonna clean my brush. I'll move this here. And I'm going to go in with a darker color here. Got my brush cleaned up. Okay. Now, let me zoom in just a little bit more on this. So I really want y'all to see this. So I'm gonna go in with a, let's go in with an orange over the top of this. The idea for glazing, I mean, think of it like glazing a ham or Put in a honey glaze on turkey. I don't know. Come here. Really dark, okay? So now I'm gonna take my paper towel and thin some of it out here. Because again, you want to be able to see some of the yellow through the orange. That's what you call creating a glaze. It has to be translucent. And keep in mind, these are just techniques, y'all. You know, a lot of people just want to go and start using stuff, but don't necessarily know techniques on how to use it. You know, techniques, you know, for different things. I mean, not just watercolors. I mean, pastel watercolors. It's techniques for everything, okay? All right, so draw that out just a little bit there. And there we go. Let me bring this up just a little bit closer. Hard to see, but you know, again, you want to be able to see some of the yellow through the orange because all you're creating is a glaze. Matter of fact, I'm going to add another glaze on top of this. Let's go with a blue. I like blue. Real watery. That's what you call when you add a lot of paint to your brush, okay? And you get what we called different intensities, okay? So notice this is a dark, intense blue, but you look at the solid wash, that is what we call a light intensity. So I'm definitely gonna draw this out some here with my paper towel. And there we go. That's what we call glazing technique. May not look like much, but you know, these watercolors, you will see everything's gonna make sense once you start doing the watercolors, okay? And for the students that do have these watercolor sets at home, practice, 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 practice. I'm showing you these techniques, but still, look up the other techniques and do those on your own. You know, practice makes perfect. I'm only introducing certain things to you. Now, one of my favorite, I love this technique because I use this technique all the time in my watercolor. When we do our watercolor painting, I'm going to show y'all some examples. So I'm cleaning my brush. This one, water is key. Water is key. You have to use a lot more water than you think, okay? So I'm loading my brush up. Still have a little blue in there. It could be cleaned a little bit better. Here. You may notice I do not have like the perfect brushes here. I don't want to. I just keep it real. We just work with what we got here. Okay, so I'm loading this block up with water. A lot of water. Now, the block is wet, and now I'm going to add wet paint on it. That's why it's called wet on wet technique, okay? So what I like to do, I actually like to dip my brush in the water. I'm going to dip into my blue because it's really kind of saturated here. I mean, like if you could see, it's almost, yeah. But actually, before I go back on there, see that? See that? So if I come here, hopefully it's going to do the same thing. And that's what we call bloom effects. Once that paint touch it, it just spread, and that's what the water helps it. It helps it do that, but you gotta have it wet enough to do. Matter of fact, on this technique, I recommend using multiple colors. I'm gonna go into my red. Now my red is like super dry right now, so I'm gonna saturate it. Come in here, a little bit more. Up there, see if it works. Now I'm gonna wet it again. Then I'm gonna come here and and there we go. Perfect wet on wet techniques. When you touch it to that block, it just spreads. Look at that. Look at that. Nice. I don't know, this seems to be a lot of people's favorite technique for some reason. I'm gonna come in here and bleed some more blue. Load it, dip it into the water, and then drop it again just to make sure it's saturated. Now, notice that I gave it a dark, intense color because I put more paint on it, and that's gonna give me a better intense, but it's also gonna make like a dark to light. That dark to light starting in the center and spreading out. Now I also will do some purple here. Our brush is loaded with purple. I'm gonna come in here, dip it in the water again. So I just want to make sure it is saturated enough. And there we go. I almost give you like a tie-dye effect. And you can actually play with the paint. You know, kind of move it in the direction you want to. And it's going to blend. Now, you can also tilt it. You know, you could tilt your paper. See that? See that? Oh, mine is really saturated. And kind of play with the paint also. But really important that you let it dry, because once it's dry, it's going to give it that real watery, almost tie-dye effect. Okay. Next one, let's go to drop color on wet color. So I'm going to wet the block first, clean my brush here. Okay, that's clean enough. Let's wet this block. So basically we're going to put down wet color first, and then we're going to come over the top of it with a drop color. So I'm going to go with blue here, so it just really shows up good. And it's wet, y'all. Sometimes you could stick it back in the water, and therefore you're getting this wet color. That color is wet. Look at the way it's spreading out. Good. Now, next I'm going to go into the purple. Now, you want to make sure your brush is really saturated. You want to make sure that color palette is really saturated, loaded with the drop color that you're going to choose. I'm choosing purple. And check this out. Move my water cup here just a little closer. See, I'm dipping it in here. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to drop the color with my brush on here. Now, you ain't got to necessarily do it this way. I just like doing it that way. Where I'm, you know, load up that brush with water and drop that color on there. Actually, I want to move some more dark, intense purples. So let's load it up with a little bit more purple, then let's touch it. There we go. That's what you call drop color on wet paint. These two, like, two of my favorite techniques to use in watercolors. Absolutely love them. All right, next one is what we call dry brush. And it's exactly like it sounds. That's what we call another name for this. It's called a thirsty brush. Brush is thirsty, man. So guess what? If your brush is like saturated with water, take your paper towel and kind of dry it out, okay? Now, I'm not saying you want to dry it out all the way. You want your brush to be a little bit damp for paint will show up, you know? So I'm gonna go with a, let's go with orange. Dip it in there. Now watch this. Take a little green. And you could put as many colors as you want. You just want to make sure you're cleaning your brush, you know, in between so you don't mix these colors up, okay? I'm actually going to use a little black. And that's it on dry brush. I mean, the idea is you want to see the brush strokes in this technique. And that is short as I could get this video, my wonderful students. Six watercolor techniques, and there we go. Let's review. We got solid wash. Everything is even. We got what we call the graded wash, where you're building a dark to light. You got what we call the glazing technique, where you want the colors to be translucent, like you could see the yellow through the orange and you could see a touch of yellow through the blue. May be hard to see, but it is there. You got what we call the wet on wet technique. That's where you got to use the water first. Load that block up with water. Same thing with drop color on wet color. Load up that block with water, drop that wet color on there first, and then drop color. Maybe I should have said wet color on drop color. And we have our dry brush. 6 watercolor techniques. There you go. Now you can stop and pause the video as much as you need to get these 6 techniques, okay? Bye-bye.